Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to particularly see how this conversation goes with Bill. We got a chance to talk earlier this week, and I have 9 pages of notes from the conversation, which tells you a little bit about the density of good material that he has to offer. So,
of course, I was starstruck looking at somebody who I watched win the World Series of Poker on TV, and when I told my son-in-law and daughter, who are avid poker fans, that you and I were going to have this conversation, I thought I was going to have to bring him here today. So.
Well, so this should be fun. I'm going to try to boil this down. We have to make this a little more compact, so to get the really wonderful wisdom that you have to offer. So I thought I would love to start this conversation kind of at the beginning, which is in the transition when you become CEO of Vanguard. And in particular, what I would love to hear from you is to talk about in these times of transition as you're coming in this new leadership role. What did you see as the challenges, but also the opportunities that type of transition offers a leader?
Yeah, so my timing was exquisite. At Vanguard, we don't believe in market timing, and I'm living proof that it doesn't work because I assumed the role 2 weeks before Lehman Brothers. And so the GFC unfolded, and, that in and of itself, Annie, provided, this real juxtaposition in terms of there was going to be a ton of opportunity, but also a ton of threats.
Right.
And, it was interesting. One of the earlier sessions when Adam was interviewing Ginny Rometty, and they're talking about her new book and how he went right into her what's enduring point, if you remember the 5 points in the book. And, for us, that actually was a really important thing. So all this chaos is happening, and what do we need to hang on to that's, helped us become such a successful company? And at the same time, all this change, all this change is going to happen. The competitive landscape is going to shift because there's going to be consolidation. All of these regulatory changes are going to come into place. And in a lot of ways, for a company that was, went into this pretty strong, those were actually opportunities more than threats.
Yeah.
So one of the things we had to do was really balance that idea of what's core to us, and at the same time, what do we have to pivot? How do we have to pivot in order to really take advantage of this opportunity to, in a sense, become even more significant company and, continue to do what we were trying to do for our clients?
So one of the things that, I found fascinating when we talked before was the way that you talked about as you came in as chairman, thinking about what is the core of what drives the decision-making and strategy across the company, in particular thinking about this core question of why do we exist? And I would love for you to share kind of what your thoughts on that was, why that was sort of coming to you as a first principle.
Yeah, so it's a great observation on your part. We did have this very long conversation. So, and again, I'll go back to the point I just made from Ginny's book about focusing in on what endures. So Vanguard was founded by one of the iconic figures of 20th century finance, Jack Bogle, and Jack created this concept about a company that would actually be owned by its clients, an investment firm owned by its customers at the end of the day. And in a sense, your only reason for being was to serve those customers. So we had that kind of differentiated structure right from the get-go. But as we've gotten bigger, more complicated, into newer markets, starting to go global, I would say some of the missionary zeal felt like it had dissipated and wasn't maybe as apparent. So we went through an exercise and we actually put a team together that was a cross-sectional team. So we had a couple senior people on it, but all the way down to really pretty junior leaders and frontline crew. And we asked them the question, rethink this whole mission idea. And we were informed by Simon Sinek, who wrote the book about why. We actually had him come in and talk and sort of get us all revved up about it. And we ended up with a very simple why, which was take a stand for investors, treat them fairly, and give them the best chance for investment success. And the thing that was so powerful about it was nothing new. But it had never been expressed quite that simply and straightforwardly, and frankly, it hadn't been created by the people who do the work, as opposed to some top-down kind of dictum or speech that I gave. So it was a really powerful exercise to go through, and that little, very simple, why do we exist, ended up helping us create the framework for making almost every decision we made, because we took that and then we developed kind of, I'll call it a business model to reflect that, where we said we had to do these certain activities. We called this our flywheel, by the way. And we're gonna have low-cost funds. You can measure that. Are you lower cost than your competitors? And we think that'll lead to outperformance. And if your funds outperform and you combine that with really good service and investor advocacy, you'll have more loyal clients. If you have more loyal clients, they'll give you more money. If they give you more money, your growth is going to be really healthy and organic. And in the investment world, as many of you may know, it's a very scalable business. So as you create scale, you have the ability, we can take the benefits of that scale, we can invest some of it back in the business, but we can also reduce our price further. And then that makes the low-cost thing work even better, and then your performance is even better, and the whole thing begins to spin. So we went through this, and then somebody looked at it and said, yeah, it's missing one thing, though. It's a beautiful picture,
right,
and it's really powerful, and we get the why, but who's going to do it? I said, well, we're going to do it. So at the heart of the flywheel, we put people, high-performing crew. Crew is our word for people, employee. And that focus on the high-performing people, because, again, we're all students. There's a lot of work that's been done. There are more corporate failures or underperformance due to lack of execution versus lack of a good strategy. It's not, it's not 0 or 1, but it's by far execution is the cause of more shortcomings. So we wanted to be really focused on the people side because we thought it would be the only way to ensure great execution. And of course, with all this, you get to, okay, this is an analytics thing, so how do you measure all this, right? So, well, actually, those components I talked about, you can measure those, but we got asked, it was interesting, it was a town hall, it was a group about this size, actually, and one of our young, just crew members who I think answered the phones or, was a first year, second year, raised his hand and said, so how do we know if we're successful? And I'm like, well, the flywheel will spin, and you'll see it in all the data. And I'm sort of making it up as I go along, and I'm not doing a very good job. And I left there thinking, And then I go to my next board meeting, and the board's like, this is really great, but how do we know if you guys are really executing? And so we ended up having to reflect that, and we ended up trying to simplify things because we're investors, so we had thousands of metrics, but we boiled everything down into 4 numbers. And it became kind of we called it our North Star, and it was 17, 90, 80, 10. And so what do they mean? So 17 goes to the heart of the flywheel, it was an engagement ratio.
Okay.
So we used Gallup's methodology at the time, and we said we want our engagement ratio to be 17 to 1, engaged to disengaged. At the time we started this, by the way, it was 3.5. So we had a long way to go. These were 10-year aspirations. We wanted 90% of our funds to beat their competitive group over 10 years, which meant basically all our funds were going to be beating their competitors. We wanted to have client loyalty at an 80 using Net Promoter Score methodology. And we also had lots of other data behind that, but we needed to simplify it, so we used Net Promoter Score. And then the 10 was Vanguard, because of its structure being owned by the clients, we didn't have a traditional P&L. So rather than say, what profitability was going to look like or whatever, we said the cost that we're going to deliver our services to our clients is going to be 10 basis points.
Okay. And
at the time it was 20. And so we said we're going to have world-class engagement, surreal investment performance, industry-leading client loyalty, and we're going to do it for half the price we're doing it today. And that's how we'll know if the flywheel's spinning. And I tell you that whole story because it actually framed every decision we made afterward. These were 10-year aspirations, but you had to make progress along the way. And so short-term, long-term, all our decision-making tied back to that framework.
So I love that kind of framework and that idea of sort of operating from first principles in that way and success falling out of that. I want to come back into what you were saying in terms of employee engagement. So we have this way that we can measure employee engagement. You come in at this dismal 3.5 to 1, obviously not ideal, shooting for 17. Can you talk a little bit about how your focus there first of all, how did you improve it? What did you improve it to? But also, how did that then tie into talent strategy in general? Because obviously those two things need to live together.
Yeah. So, it's, all I can say is I sat through Alex Furman's talk earlier and the Performica stuff. Oh my God, do I wish we had those tools back then, because it would have been so helpful to have that whole network thing. There's a real powerful thing there, but we didn't have that. So, we went through sort of a very simple analysis of the engagement survey, and there were 2 or 3 basic things. So we weren't doing a good job explaining comp. We actually had really good benefits, but people didn't understand them, and what could we do to make that more apparent? People didn't feel they had a best friend at work. Those of you who know the Gallup thing know that that's like a really big deal. It's like the biggest predictor of success. So we tackled those things first. So the comp was relatively easy to do. We always want to pay fairly and we want to pay well, so we were able to make some adjustments there. Benefits was interesting. There we had to do a couple things that were tangible. So we actually built out a health clinic at our main campus, and then in our big subsidiary campuses, we put health clinics, which actually saved us a ton of money and improved employee health. And at the same time, really, got people excited about what the benefits programs really meant, because they could feel it, they could touch it. And then, in the best friend at work, we just really encouraged that people to think about that and talk about it in staff meetings. So year 2, the number jumps from 3.5 to 6. So we're like, okay, we made progress. We get to 8, and then we just sort of flatline for a couple years. And then, again, we had to start to peel the onion a little bit more deeply, and we got into really what I think were the heart of the issues, which were all around leadership. And so we went deep on the leadership front, and people told us that they didn't think leadership was empathetic to what they were doing. They didn't have clarity about certain things. And as a senior team, we're like killing ourselves. Like we're going, gosh, we spend all this time and all this money. We're out there doing town halls. We're trying to communicate. Well, this is again where you got to be careful what you got to actually understand what the data really tell you. And so we sat focus groups down to go through the numbers, and they're like, no, you don't understand. Like, we're not talking about you guys. We don't care about you guys. You guys are fine. Our frontline managers and their bosses have no idea what we're doing. They're always in meetings. They're always working on projects. And by the way, the only way you get promoted is if you're a young leader at Vanguard is not to develop your team, it's to work on a really big project. So these truths start to come out and actually tie to the data. So we had to go change our whole leadership methodology, and we revamped the training programs, revamped the way we tried to model. And again, as you know, these things don't go in straight lines, but there were some step function improvements because of that. We got into one of the, and I know you're going to do, Annie's actually going to go out to Vanguard, and has been out to Vanguard and talk to some of our leaders. The diversity of our leadership team wasn't where it needed to be, especially on gender. And so we had to put some special effort around that. And again, that all came through the more you peeled back the data. So the net of it was complete rethinking of our leadership development programs, complete rethinking of how we actually hired people and what tracks we put them on as we brought them in. And what we tried to do there was really get people into leadership roles at a much earlier stage of their career and give them opportunities to see lots of different parts of the company quickly. And again, things like that really helped.
So what did you actually get the number up to in the end?
So in the end, it was fun. We got to 14 and a half. I think they've probably gone higher since I left. So I'm hoping it's continued. We did hit the 90 on the investment. We hit 80 net promoter score on all but one of our businesses, and we did get the expense ratio did go from 20 to 10. So we were pretty successful at that. But I would tell you, it wasn't until we figured out the people side that the business results actually followed.
Yeah. I mean, what I love about what you're talking about is obviously in high growth environments, you can get this disconnection, right? And the question that I think that you were you were trying to answer was, in your case, if we have great leadership at the top, how do we allow those best practices to then cascade down and make sure that we're training the leaders that we're not necessarily that in touch with, so that they're interacting in the same way with the same connection across the whole org?
Yeah, that was certainly a lot of the focus.
Yeah. So there's a question here that actually relates to what my next question was going to be. So that was lucky. So I'm going to be able to kill two birds with one stone. Which is, so, as you're thinking about, so we're talking now about, as we're thinking about decision making and leadership, how do we allow that in a vertical way to cascade down? In terms of just sort of decision strategy across the org, how are you thinking about, particularly as you're coming into the great financial crisis, which is an interesting time to sort of get thrown into a leadership role. How are you thinking about the interaction between short-term and long-term decision making?
Yeah, so look, my simple rule of thumb was, if it's existential, you got to move fast.
Yeah.
And the GFC was very existential. We didn't know whether the systems were all going to hold, whether banking system was going to be there tomorrow, whether the stock market would function the way we hoped, whether the bond market would. Bond market was actually a bigger worry for us. So one of the things we did, our senior team met every morning and every night. So, once virtually, once in person, and we just went through essentially tick lists of things we had to decide on. And we didn't have all the data. We didn't have all the information that we would normally want to have to make these decisions, but we felt like we had to act with a lot of speed, and that if we were wrong, we would, we'd hopefully get a chance to correct, but if we didn't, you live with the consequences. You had to be accountable. But it was, speed was really, really important then. And some of these were big things and some of them were little. But I'll give you like one pressure we were getting from the board was, hey, your assets are going down. So, when the stock market's down, peak to trough was down 55%. Vanguard's 70% equity, so our revenue, if you will, was down 35%. So what are you going to do about your cost structure? And 80%, 90% of our costs were people. And we went back, we didn't have time to study this, right? We just said, we're not doing any reductions in force. And the board was like, what do you mean you're not going to do a reduction in force? Your cost structure is going to kill you. And we're like, we'll actually be very transparent to our customers that their costs are actually going to go up. We're going to actually increase our fees, even though the markets are down, because we are not going to reduce the people side, because we felt that would send a signal to the customers that we didn't have confidence that we would eventually get to the backside of this terrible crisis. And we thought sending that message of optimism, not only to our own people so that they weren't worried about their jobs, but also to the marketplace was really important. But we didn't have any data to really back this up. This was just it actually felt like, were we standing up for the investor? Were we, ultimately giving them a better chance for success, because we felt like having the right people talk to them and help them through this would be very positive.
Yeah, what I love about the way that you're thinking about that is that essentially everything is supposed to be long-term decision making, but short-term decisions that you make should be in service of the long-term health of the company, and there's different ways to get there. So you're talking about getting there almost towards signal to the market, taking care of people. A startup today, for example, might be just preserve cash. Right. So exactly. The short-term decision in service of the long-term decision there might be reduction in force, right? So if you're thinking about it in that way, you can get to the right short-term answer.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, because, and it's going to be different company to company and circumstance to circumstance. For us, you could the fear in the marketplace was palpable. Like when I would get on the phones and talk to investors, and they would say, we did everything you said, and our accounts are down 30%.
Right.
What am I going to do? I can't retire when I thought I was. How am I going to pay for my kids' education? These were really heartfelt. These were difficult discussions. And so you could feel that fear. So, again, this was much more of I'll call it an EQ-based decision than an IQ-based decision.
So I love that. That's a good segue into there's some amazing questions from the audience. It's very hard to choose. So I'm so sorry if I don't get to yours. But there's a few that are kind of in a group. So one of them is sort of speaking to, so I want to give you two at once because they're in the same vein. How did you make decisions when the data was unclear or when it clashed with your intuition? So that, I think that's in this vein, right, of what happens when you're sort of into the unknown or the uncertain. And related to that is, how do you approach investment decisions that are data rich versus people decisions that might be data sparse? I feel like those are sort of in the same family of segueing from what you just brought up.
So for both of those, the biggest thing, when we didn't have as good data as we want, and maybe whatever data we had clashed with, certainly my intuition, my default was to really gather as many people as possible.
Yeah. And
I wanted to get as many inputs. And sometimes, again, because of speed, you had to really make that process quick. But for some of these decisions, you actually had a little bit of time.
Right.
And the ability to collaborate and actually hear other opinions was really, really important. And I can't tell you how many times where it was somebody coming in almost at a weird angle to a problem actually made the difference. So I'll give you a very simple example. This is practical. So many of you, if you know the investment world, there's this thing called an exchange traded fund, right? So ETFs, they're a big thing now. Vanguard's the second largest ETF provider in the world. At the time, our founder had said ETFs, it's like giving nuclear weapons to terrorists. And he thought they were just a horrific product, that they would be misused because you can trade them daily. You can trade them all the time, as opposed to a mutual fund, index fund, which is in theory more long-term oriented. So that was, and we were actually faced with a decision around, we should go bigger into the ETF market or not.
Right.
One of, a number of my colleagues would lay out the data and say, the data say that ETFs are a fad, and here are all the reasons why. My intuition was, I wasn't really sure, again, full disclosure, I was agnostic on the question. And it was one of our young analysts came in and said, we're looking at the data completely wrong. And he brought in, a group of other inputs, and basically showed that we had been looking at the data completely incorrectly. And we had been looking at market share a certain way, and when he sort of deconstructed the market share, everybody all of a sudden got religion that maybe ETFs were a different thing and that we needed to approach it differently. And it was a great example where, it would have been easy to say no because we were doing really well. And, today that part of the business is 40% of Vanguard. So, from a standing start a decade ago. And it was really this idea, of bringing in more voices. So, the short answer to the question is, when the data are unclear, this is where diversity of thought, opinion, and experience is really, really valuable. And then, the leadership team's job is to sort of sift through that and try to figure out if there's a best answer. But boy, you're so much better informed when you do that.
Yeah, so what I love about that is this idea of, we always have to remember that data are not truth, right? That we're modeling the data, and different people can have different viewpoints of how you model that data. So when we're in uncertain environments, the more viewpoints of people who have expertise enough to give you a good viewpoint, the more viewpoints that you can get looking at a problem, that in itself is data, right? We have to not forget that there's the objective facts, but then there's also the subjective portion of it. And if we can get different ways to look at it to get to something like what Daniel Kahneman called the outside view, yes. That's going to help us actually to get to something closer to our best guess of what's ground truth. So I love the way that you thought about that, right? Looking at the data one way, then someone else comes in and looks at it another way, and all of a sudden you discover the truth that obviously ends up driving outsized results for you. All right, well, I think we have time for one very quick one, just because I think it would be malpractice on my part if I did not ask this question, given the title of my last book, which is leaders sometimes have to quit projects or programs that lots of employees are invested in and love. How do you make those calls without killing morale? This is the speed round.
Wow. I think I have a very deep belief that strategy is as much about what you don't do as what you do. And so I think you have to frame it strategically. And you basically have to make the case that if you're going somewhere strategically, if something is not actually contributing to that in a very meaningful way versus other options you have, other things you're doing, then you have to say goodbye. And
Right.
it's really difficult to do. The simplest example, and we're going to be out of time, but we had a couple of local offices, and as we became a pure virtual company, we decided we were going to close these local offices. Oh my God, the hue and cry, from some of those local customers, but also from our people was unbelievable. But take that money and put it into development of Vanguard.com was a way better use and actually expanded what we were able to do for people dramatically. So, again,
Going back to that first principle.
you always have to get back to that first principle.
Yeah. Well, this has been so enjoyable for me. I know that throughout this week and today, I've learned so much from you, and I'm so happy that I got to have this time with you, and I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you.